Hello, we'll get started in just a moment. Well, hello, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Hannah Palmer, and I am joining you from my studio in Hapeville, Georgia. I want to thank you for spending some time with me. Maybe it's your lunch hour. It's noon here, or 12:03 here in the Atlanta area. I want to thank LSU Press for hosting this virtual book launch event. I'll introduce myself and then talk a little bit about my new book. This is really exciting. It's launch time for the book. The Pool is Closed: Segregation, Summertime, and the Search for a Place to Swim. I'm super excited and a little nervous. This is the first time I've done a virtual book launch. So I'll talk for maybe 20 minutes or so, and then I'll have a chance to answer some of your questions, and hope you can add those in the chat. And Sunny from LSU Press will send some of those questions over to me. Okay, so we'll do a little show and tell. I'm used to doing lots of presentations with slideshows and PowerPoints, and I thought for this, I'm just gonna do show and tell for you guys, and not share my screen and do too much of a technical presentation. Some of you may be familiar with my work. I write in a really personal style, so I thought I would make this a personal talk. And yeah, so a little bit about me. I published my first book in 2017, and I have that here. It's a book called Flight Path and Search for Routes Beneath the World's Busiest Airport. Someone pointed out to me that both my books have the word search in the subtitle. So that these books have a lot in common. They both are sort of half memoir, half cultural history of the South. And they both have a lot to do with me searching for lost places. And this book was about lost neighborhoods and lost homes around Hartsfield-Jackson, the world's busiest airport. And as soon as this book was published in 2017, I had launched into a project where I was researching the Flint River. The Flint River is Georgia's second longest river, and it's marked on the giant map behind me. It's that river in the south. And I had started a career really studying waterways, hidden waterways in Atlanta. And had already become really fascinated by rivers and creeks and their impact on the urban form of the city. I was an English major, so I'd spent all of my education really studying poetry and words and nonfiction, creative nonfiction. And my MFA project was this book, which is opened up a lot of questions for me about urban development and cities and how they affect people's destiny. I found a lot of vocabulary in architecture and urban design to express the feelings of violence and grief that I felt in the landscape. So, yeah, so I ended up writing a lot about urban history and urban development. But as soon as that book was published in 2017, people immediately were asking me, Hannah, what is your next book? Which was kind of overwhelming to me. It's sort of like when you have your first child, before you even get your baby home from the hospital, people say, are you going to have another child? You're so exhausted and sleep deprived that you can't answer that question right. Um, but yeah, so I had to say, I hope so. God willing, I will have another book. I will have another child. And I already knew that I wanted to write about water because the work I was doing, thinking about the Flint River and its survival, its resilience, the fact that this river was flowing under the airport and was full of life was so inspiring to me. And I was learning so much about water's impact on people's lives and on the form of the city. I knew I was interested in thinking about water, and it seemed like such an enormous topic that surely I could write a whole book about water. I could think about it for years. And there was so much I didn't know because I've never studied science. Seriously, I'd never studied hydrology or engineering. I mean, I felt truly naive and curious. So sure, I was already thinking I'm going to write something about water. But where the idea for the book really crystallized for me was in the summer of 2017 with my little children. At that point, that little baby on the cover, that's Guy Palmer. He's the baby in this picture, but he was about 6 years old that summer when I visited a swimming pool with him and some friends in Hapeville, where I am today, close to where I live on the south side of Atlanta. And at this pool with some friends, it was a summer when my kids were 6 and 4, and little boys, I assume little girls are the same. This is around the age when kids need to learn how to swim because they don't have any fear of water. They think that they can swim. They run gleefully into the water with no sense of caution. And I started realizing that they were in danger and that I needed to get them some lessons, some practice, some access to water. So I felt urgently that I needed to get them in the water. I needed to get them to a pool. So I was like giving myself a mom assignment, get them some lessons, let's get them to the water. So I was at a pool in 2017. All of this is in the introduction to The Pool is Closed. And in the first chapter of The Pool is Closed, I just lay all this out. I was like, we were at this pool and it hit me like a lightning bolt, like an epiphany that the pool we were visiting was segregated. And that it had been built, in fact, in the 60s as a country club for white people who were fleeing the public pools during the civil rights era, the time of desegregation. And what was amazing to me was that the swimming pool in 2017, at least the day we were visiting, appeared to be a relic of that time. It appeared that day to remain a place of all white segregation. And I had to ask myself, is this pool still segregated by law or by culture, de facto or de jure? And how is it that segregation still persists? And do I want to be part of that? Do we want to join this pool? It's the perfect place for my kids to learn to swim, but can I be part of that? So I had a lot of questions. Where did this pool come from? How does segregation continue to persist in the landscape? And I said, I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to search for swimming pools. So I gave myself the assignment to just document a year of looking for water. I had a lot to learn. So I set out this assignment. 2018 is going to be the year my kids learn to swim. And that's what the book is. It is a diary of a year of swimming. And it's not just swimming pools. The beautiful cover, it suggests that it's about pools. And I would say a huge part of the book is about pools, but it's also just about swimmable waters. We visit in the book the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean. So there's quite a bit about segregated beaches. Swimmable waters includes some lakes, reservoirs, creeks, rivers, and unfortunately, many of those lakes and rivers are polluted or inaccessible because they're privatized. And a lot of the pools we visited were difficult to access because there's a lifeguard shortage, or there's a swim team practicing, or these pools have been defunded or fallen into disrepair. And I'm sure if you're listening, you've also had the experience of just seeing how difficult it is to get yourself into a swimming situation. It can take a lot of planning. And then sometimes you just show up and there's thunder in the distance and the pool abruptly closes, or some kid, maybe it was my kid a couple times in the book, barfed in the pool and the whole pool has to shut down because there's some issue. So the book is half memoir, and I told a lot of stories about just anxiety and trauma and just all kinds of stuff that happened through the course of the year. And also I weave in, what I was learning about these places that we visited. I did a lot of research into just the national history of swimming pools. So there's a lot about, these local pools. Where I live in the city of East Point, it's adjacent to Hapeville. It's part of Metro Atlanta. There's a lot of the history of the pools that were lost here. I ended up calling them ghost pools because they were buried. But it turns out there's dozens of these pools all over the South, hundreds all over the nation, pools that were funded in the era of the WPA by the federal government, but were largely defunded during desegregation because of white flight and white communities not really wanting to continue funding pools that they had to share with the Black community. And then by the time I was growing up in the early 80s, these pools had been filled in and converted to tennis courts or parking lots, or in some really strange cases that I found multiple times, these pools were turned into museums. And in East Point, the former swimming pool is now the Historical Society, which I found both ironic and actually somewhat cruel, that a site that was a swimming pool became a history center that did not tell the history of the swimming pool. So a really important primary or source for me was this book, Contested Waters by Jeff Wilsey. The subtitle is A Social History of Swimming Pools in America. It's an amazing history book, but it's not about the South. He really focused on pools in the Northeast and kind of Rust Belt area. Some of the first battlegrounds over swimming pools in America were really in like St. Louis and New York. These are places outside of really the Jim Crow South, where the first riots and really sites of violence over kind of desegregating public swimming pools. The stuff was happening in the 40s, like way before Atlanta or the South were fighting over swimming pools. It taught me so much about how these trends were about so much more than Atlanta or more than East Point, and kind of lifted a lot of the shame away from talking about, lost pools in the South, because it's so much more than Atlanta. Um, Jeff Wiltsey was kind enough to read my manuscript and write a blurb for it. I also, in the process of writing my diary about swimming pools, I was calling my diary water log because it literally was just a log of every time we tried to get in the water. And there were dozens and dozens of pools that we visited, and creeks and rivers. At some point, someone pointed out to me, a friend said, there is a great book called Waterlog, and it's from 1999. I just wanted to tell you, if you haven't read it, it's called Waterlog. It's by Roger Deacon. He's a British author, and he coined the term wild swimming. He swam in rivers all over England. It's a great book. It's really different than mine, and part of what makes it different was also inspiring to me because he just liked to swim in these rivers all over England, and he really had no sense of his privilege as he did this. He trespassed. He was sort of an adventurer, and he was kind of a scholar, a gentleman, and he wrote a lot about. He was an environmentalist, and whereas I, both as a woman and as a mom, had to be really careful about trespassing, pollution, access. And I often found I could not get into the water. I could not access spaces for my own safety and for my children's safety. So many places we tried to get to the water, we were turned away. And imagine, it just gave me just the tiniest glimpse of what people have felt who were in low-income communities of color for most of history in the South, who were not permitted by law to enjoy water in the South. So the book is, I would say, The Pool is Closed is kind of a sad read also, because I spent a lot of time in the book listening to my Black neighbors tell me stories about disparities in access to water, stories of exclusion, and also some tragic stories. Because if you look at water long enough, you start to hear some stories about drowning and stories of exclusion and not being allowed to access water. And I feel like the emotional heart of the book come from some of my Black neighbors who told me about people they've lost in some tragic stories. And some of those stories don't have anything to do with swimming pools. It has to do with stormwater flooding. So we're looking at an unequal landscape where people, one woman in particular, I told the story of her death. I was able to research it with her family, a woman who drowned in my neighborhood in a river that flooded on a day when it just, there was stormwater flooding and in a place that had just been modified because of urban development. So read with care, I guess, is something I would add. It's the product of a lot of listening and growth over time. And it's just what happens when you take the time to listen to your neighbors. And it took me a long time to hear these stories. These are stories that I think I've been hearing my whole life, but because I slowed down and started talking to my neighbors about water, I was surprised at some of the stories that people had to share. Let's see. I wanted to share one of the ways that the book came about. I had been writing about the Flint River and about access to water and publishing some short pieces over time. The manuscript came together sort of slowly because I write at the speed of personal growth, I guess. The year-long diary was 2018, and then through 2019, and then through 2020, we revisited some of these pools to see if they changed. And in 2020, a lot of the pools were completely closed during the pandemic. So a lot of research and a lot of interviews over time. But in 2022, I published an essay in the Bitter Southerner about the Flint River, and I have this it's called Alleged River was the name of that piece. And this was, it was about like, how do you define a river? like what is a river? In the case of the Flint River, which is where the woman drowned, I mentioned Carolyn Harmon. In the airport area, the river is not called a river. It just looks like a ditch. And in no place on the map was it called the Flint River. There were no signs that called it the Flint River. And it's a case of a river that had been erased, sort of like these swimming pools had been erased from the landscape, but the water that filled the pools, the spring water, is still flowing. And in the case of the river, the creeks were still flowing, the springs were still flowing. It just no longer was called a river. So I interviewed some scientists and some artists and fishermen, and asked people, how do you define river? And it turns out it's not a scientific term. It's a more ephemeral concept. And that was the piece that I think LSU Press, the editors at LSU Press saw that piece and reached out to me and asked, do you have more writing about water? I was happy to say that I had hundreds of pages of writing about water. That was the piece that led to the book that became The Pool is Closed. That I was still calling Waterlog, even though I knew that couldn't possibly be the title because there was already a cult classic book already named Waterlog. So I have to give full credit to the wonderful team at LSU Press because they took my manuscript and gave it a wonderful new title, which is very provocative and evocative. And they gave it a wonderful cover and made this delightful object that is now for sale. But I also wanted to recommend another book. The book that I have written is, like I said, half memoir, kind of half cultural history of swimming pools and swimmable waters in the South and sort of the state of affairs, because even today, here it is 2024, it's really hard to find a place to access water, and it's pointing out the myth of the inclusive city. It's pointing out that as our climate changes and as our city grows, these disparities in drownings are only going to get worse. Access to water becomes more and more of a privilege of the few. It's not just a luxury to access water, it is a life and death issue for many people. And I think it's going to provoke in people this sense that what do we do about that? And I'm not running for office, so I'm not like filling the book with policy solutions. I am, however, pointing out throughout the book places where it's done differently. There's in the book I visit in the course of 2018, we actually did leave the South. We did visit some other cities. We made it to Colorado. We made it to San Francisco. We made it to Tennessee. We made it to some other places outside of Atlanta. We made it to the coast. And we did see several moments in the book, one in East Point and one on Tybee Island and on the coast of Georgia, where full proposals came up and were defeated. So not just old pools that were filled in, but new pools that were proposed and were defeated. So there are some moments in the book where one is confronted with the idea of like, what if we tried to build new pools now? If the book, if it does like provoke those questions in you about what do we do next, I just want to recommend also another book, my last show and tell for you, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee is another wonderful book that really gets to the heart of kind of the essential systemic racism that sort of prevents us from funding public good. And it's not just about swimming pools, it's about pools, it's about social programs that really rely on community funding across many, many programs, many spheres. So these are I just want to show you kind of some of the different readings that go into becoming the ingredients of the things that I think about as I'm writing. I have many other books. Some are underneath my laptop right now that are part of the things I was thinking about as I was writing. Yeah. So I continue to publish short pieces about water, and to think about water. And since I started on this book and continued on this book, I now have a full-time job working for an engineering firm um, that's called Hazen and Sawyer, and all we do is water infrastructure. So now I am like a full-time science writer, and I'm learning a lot about the science of water infrastructure, and I write about it as my job, which is very exciting. And I feel like I've gone back to school because every day I'm learning more about the technical side of purifying water and distributing water and moving water around the world. And I find, again, it's funny to me that I went to school for literature and creative writing, and I'm still using those skills very much, but learning more about how the world works and how water is part of it. So if there's another book for me to write, I think it's going to have to do with water infrastructure even more. And lately, I've been writing a lot about toilets and human dignity. Um, so I think that's kind of like the gist of my book talk and all the ideas that went into making The Pool is Closed. Um, except one last thing I would say about it is that, um, and this is true for my first book too, for Flight Path, is that both of these books are like a love letter to Jason Palmer. I want to be very clear about that like Jason Palmer is my husband and my muse. So there's a hefty love story in both of these books too. There's kind of he's like the plot of both of these books. So anybody who buys Flight Path thinking it's about airplanes, or who buys The Pool is Closed thinking it's about swimming pools, might be surprised to know there's a love story in both of them as well. All right. Well, I will wrap up my remarks with that. And so, if you like that kind of thing, social history, uh, love story, infrastructure, you know, indictment of systemic racism, all rolled into one hybrid genre memoir, you might like my book. And Sunny with LSU Press says that you can buy the book. There's a link in the comment section. There should be a promo code in there that will get you 40% off. And that is like the best discount you will ever get from LSU Press. And I think that she is going to send me some of your questions in the chat. How's
Uh,
that?
yep, I'm going to be reading questions to you. So the first one we have here is your writing blends your personal story with much bigger historical forces. How do you find the balance between those two types of storytelling in your work?
Mhm. How do you find the balance? Good question. I don't know. I think there's a lot of I think that is the art and not the science of creative writing. And I would say that a lot of that is um, poetic impulse. Um, okay, one answer to that, I grew up in church and listening to sermons a lot. And if you've ever listened to sermons, the preacher, the pastor often balances a sermon with humor, scripture, personal anecdote, persuasion. Um, a TED Talk does this too. A TED Talk will balance a personal story with some research, and really we'll have to like find this balance. Or a stand-up comedian will sometimes do a lot of like dancing with the audience to balance like telling a story. I mean, honestly, when you tell a story at a dinner party, you are dancing with your listener to make sure that you're leading them into the story. And I try to tell a story that does that as well, that like I will tell part of a personal story, and then I will start to bring in some research, and then I'll get back to the personal. The answer is drafts. I read aloud to my best readers, which are my writers group and my husband. um, Drafting, reading aloud to myself, reading aloud to my best readers. it's, I don't know, practice and drafting. And then you start to realize sometimes, oh, that's getting dead and boring in the middle. I need to like break it up with a little more of like what I'm seeing and hearing.
Thank you.
Practice.
As a follow-up for that, can you talk more about your research process and how you found information to support the personal narrative side of the book?
Sure. So for example, we, me and the kids would go visit a pool. I would just observe what we saw that day. You know, what did the pool look like? Who was there? And then I would go home and I would go to like historicaerials.com and I would look at like what did the pool look like? Historicaerials.com is just an amazing resource. You can see aerial photos of a space back through the years. And I would see here's what it looked like today, here's what it looked like in the 70s, here's what it looked like in the 50s. You can see all the way back to when it was farmland and when not every site has like all this, but some of Atlanta's um, pools, I could see what it looked like in the 30s. And then I would go on like newspapers.com and see, here's I could find, the opening day ribbon cutting for when the pool opened in the 60s. And then I could go to see how it was funded. They got some money from the federal government to build a bunch of pools in the 1960s. Um, so the research process, so much of this is online. You can look through newspaper archives. Uh, because I've been in Atlanta a long time, I have all these like tabs on my browser where I know how to research the City of Atlanta meeting minutes and the Atlanta Regional Commission all the plans for the region. But wherever you are, you can look up the county tax assessor data to understand property records. Um, you can look up USGS historic maps to see how land has developed over time. Um, Newspaper archives are great. Your library card will give you access to a lot of historic newspapers. So it's not just, in my case, the standard newspapers, the Atlanta Journal Constitution, but then there's all like the Black newspapers, which in our case, it's the Atlanta Daily World, which will give you a whole different perspective on the same story. Your library card is such a great key to giving you different perspectives on the story. Those are just a couple ways that from my couch at home I can be surfing the internet and getting all these little background stories. And then when I get off my couch, I'll go to the local historical society and start talking to people who'll say, oh, you need to go interview this lady, she remembers. You need to go talk to this guy. Or then you start getting like city council meeting minutes from 50 years ago. And then you go to the history center. Then you fall down the rabbit hole. And then 5 years later, you write a book.
Thank you. Our next question is how do your two sons look back on that year of swimming that you write about in the book? Was it fun for them? Was it a source of anxiety? And are they more aware of social and especially racial issues today because of their experiences?
Well, that year when they were 4 and 6, I don't know if they remember that year in particular. They're they hated taking lessons. They felt a lot of anxiety about lessons. They generally didn't think they were okay. Anytime we went to a pool and there were other kids there, they had a great time. Anytime that I said we're going to lessons, they felt anxiety and stress. And there were some tears about that. There was some vomiting in the pool about that. Um, yeah, lessons that they hated. It was really stressful. Whenever they had to take lessons, they thought I was trying to kill them. Learning to swim is terrifying for people. I don't think it's just children. I think adults too. It's just very frightening. Group lessons were frightening for them. Individual lessons were frightening for them. And the best I learned was that keeping those lessons like very short, like 20 minutes tops. And then rewards afterwards were the best. But anytime we went to swim and it was like groups of kids playing, they loved it. And the year of pool hopping, one pool after another, they loved it. It was time with me, time with their dad, time exploring the city. They thought it was awesome. And I mean, they would wake up on Saturday morning and be like, where are we going today? What new pool are we going to go see today? Can we go see a new pool? Can we get our friends to go? They thought it was a great adventure. And now they may 10 years from now be in therapy talking to their therapist about all this. I don't know. We'll see.
Thank you. You talked about this a bit, what you're sort of working on now. But can you talk more about what your next project or projects might look like and similarities, differences with this current project?
Yeah, I started earlier this year in the spring. I started writing a couple pieces about the lack of public toilets in Atlanta, and uh, I published something earlier this month. It's a short essay, but I think it's one of the best things I've ever written. It's a short essay and it went viral and it was just about how there's no public toilets in Atlanta, and it's just an issue of human dignity, and it's such a vestige of Jim Crow in Atlanta. It's so obvious that it's just like um yeah, it's just a show. It's just like such an evidence of the remains of Jim Crow racism in Atlanta, that there's no place to use the bathroom unless you're affluent. So I don't know if I want to write a whole book about that, but it's become a project for my church to try to figure out how to provide a public toilet, because my church is right downtown where the problem is most acute. So there, we have a whole team, and we're trying to figure out how to build public facilities right on our campus. And of course, if we do that, I'm going to end up writing about it. So that is a project that I might end up writing about. And because it's like connected to water and infrastructure, and it's going to be expensive and long term, it's something I'll probably end up writing about. I've also been following several people on the subject of natural springs and people who are restoring natural springs. That's something I've been really interested in. And again, I don't know if that's a book, but there's something really sacred about water coming up out of the earth. And it's like, again, I've just been still interested in water. Um, there's a there's a family issue that I've been uh, that I'm curious about, and it's also connected to water, and all these things may end up all in another book. Yeah, the family issue also has to do about uh, land, and land that is sacred, and land that is uh, being, I don't know how to describe this. This will be a book when it crystallizes in my head. With both Flight Path and with The Pool is Closed, there was a moment where it was just crystal clear, and it still took 5 years to write, 5 or 6 years to write the book, but it became just like, yep, that's the concept, that's what I'm doing, and I'm just gonna take my time. Um, but the idea of like how people kind of like make a sacred place for themselves, and that has to do with like clearing land for a spring or clearing a place that is sacred. That's something I've been thinking about for a while. So I don't know if that's a book, but it's a seed of a book.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Ramona, asking about, in the book, did you write about segregated pools within organizations like the YMCA or YWCA?
I think I I don't think I included that in the book. What's interesting though is I did this whole public art project last year called Ghost Pools, and I did cover that in that project because the YMCA was a big part of that project. But I don't think I ended up including it in the book. Though the YMCA does have a really interesting history of keeping separate the white YMCA and the black YMCA. And I did study that for a project I did in Tuscaloosa and then one in Atlanta, but I don't think that made it into the book. That's a good question. I think the YMCA is still reckoning with that past. The the once you start like looking at pools, it's just such a huge topic. And with the book, I ended up having to cut a lot just to like keep it focused. And I don't think I included that part. No.
Thank you. We have a sort of fun, unrelated-ish question from Craig asking if your husband grew up in Roswell, because if so, they may have gone to school together. No? All right.
No, both Jason and I are from Forest Park, Georgia.
There you go. All right. Sorry, Craig. But thank you for sharing that. Okay, well, that is our last question, so we can go ahead and say thank you and goodbye to the audience.
Thank you so much.